Hello? Oh, it is on. Excellent. Right. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Richard Miller, and I'm here today to talk to you about what I get from the full stack framework, and I guess what I could see as some of the advantages for many of you as well using that. So a little bit about me first. I'm a software engineer at SymfonyLive UK. I've got about 8 years of commercial experience in PHP development now, and I guess I'm on Twitter as Mr. R. Miller. Okay, so I'm guessing quite a few of you are developers, and for me, a lot of your day job is probably, as it is for me, actually making applications using PHP. Probably with Symfony involved in that, I guess, if you're here. So, and when you're doing that, a lot of the time it's like you want to be getting things done, sort of ticking off the needs of the application, making progress with that. But with using Symfony, still you do it not just rushing through it, but doing it with a good foundation, using best practices, and what have you. And I think that using the full stack framework, is a really good way of doing this. And because there's been a lot of, it's great that Symfony 2 is not this big monolithic framework, but it's made up of these components that you can reuse elsewhere, and you're in standard distribution, you're getting other libraries and things as well. And so you might sort of, think, well, why use the framework? Why not just start to put it together out of components and the libraries and sort of wire it all up together yourself? And, there's been this sort of movement recently of sort of idea of micro PHP and the framework's bad and it's too heavyweight and all this. But I just think that, you can get bogged down when you're trying to write applications and end up being miserable when you're unhappy like this guy, when you're trying to make sort of progress with the application and that you're just getting sidetracked into other tasks. So just, you want to get going, but you're just like having to wire up all the various parts yourself, and you're writing a lot of sort of boilerplate code to stitch everything together. And whenever you want to use a new library, you're having to learn it in great depth just to get anywhere. And these are the sort of things that stop you from making that progress with the application. And for me, it's like making the progress, seeing things happen is what makes me happy when I'm developing. But it certainly, and also it makes our bosses, our customers, and our users happy, because they're not interested necessarily in, how you use the routing component to get from the URLs to the action. Like for them, that just happens on every website. What's so cool about the way you've done it here? What they want to see is their business ideas turned into this application that you're building. And so I guess I want to say, talk about how I think that using the full stack framework and avoiding this idea of just putting it all together yourself in this way can help you to avoid some of those diversions away from making progress. So avoid getting diverted into just, saying, well, I've got this component and this component and this component, but how do I actually get them working together? And avoid getting diverted into writing a lot of code where taking these libraries, which are often fantastic libraries, but there's this gap between the library as it's written to be used in a variety of frameworks or standalone and how it will work in your application. And quite often you can get diverted in writing a lot of code to tie the two together. And also I've mentioned when you're using a new library and you want to use something, maybe something you've not used before, then yeah, it's great. It's really cool, but part of our job is often learning new technologies, and we don't just stand still doing the same thing day in, day out. We learn new things, we get to grips with all these new libraries. But sometimes it's nice to just add it and get it going and then learn the cool stuff, and not sit down and troll through all the stuff and have to learn every last thing about it before you can even get anything out of it, before it'll work at all. And so one of the first sort of details, for me, it's quite often it's the first sort of sticking point towards not making progress and not feeling like you're achieving things when you first start a new application. And you've got to, start getting something out of it. And, we don't want to rush things and paint ourselves into a corner by getting there too quickly and without building it on this sort of flexible basis. But you still want to see progress quickly. You don't want to be going to meetings after 2 weeks of a project saying, yeah, well, soon we'll start getting something out of it. It's, you want to be able to go to your customers and show them that their ideas are making it into the application, the things that they're interested in, they're starting to show fruition. So yeah, I mean, Fabio mentioned, has been talking about like Symfony itself is this great set of powerful components that are specifically designed to kind of work with a lot of those common web problems. So sort of the HTTP foundation, we're getting abstraction from the HTTP request and the response, and you've got routing to get you from the URLs into an action that can transform that request into a response and return it. And other things, forms, security, all these things that are a major part of the vast majority of web applications. So if you're using them without the framework, then you've got to sort of start, say I want to use the routing, so how do I start to, what do I do with this component? You need to start looking at that. How do I get configuration into it? How do I tell it about the routes? If you're installing the standard distribution of the full stack framework, then if that's set up out of the box, you can just start adding to the routing file, to the YAML file. But additionally to that, because of the bundles that you also get in the full stack framework, those things that are over and above the components and the libraries that you get, then you get things thrown in like routing with annotation. So instead of having to go and learn what's going on and work out the routing component, we can just start adding controllers with the actions and just add a routing annotation, and we're done. It's like, so you can start to see things straight away happening with your application. And the other thing that comes from these bundles that you get when you're using the full stack framework is commands for helping you generate some of the tasks. So when we first start up, it's like we want to put together folder structure, directory structure in which to keep our code. And it's the best will in the world, as much as the application you're building might be this fancy thing that does all these new things, there's always going to be an element of the same old repetitive code. So one of the things you're getting with the framework are the commands that get registered, which allow you to generate things quickly. So we can generate a bundle. So again, we mentioned the bundles. So the bundles that you get that are over and above the components and the libraries. So they serve several tasks. We're going to talk about some more about how they sort of glue those things together and help wire them up. But they also give you our way of structuring your application, the code that's specific to your application. And even getting it up and running, we can run the command, it'll ask us a few questions, and then generate the basic folder structure and some of the classes, so the extension class and things, so you can load in configuration, it's all done for you. So again, sort of saving us time, getting us going quickly in the first place. And also with the bundles, they give you this common directory structure. So for one thing, you're not having to sort of spend time thinking, where do I want to keep my stuff? You can make use of this. And the other way I find it saves time, and that's great, is that not only are the bundles you're using for your application structured like this, you're also getting, so are the other bundles that are included in the framework, and also the third-party bundles that you might add in. So then you're you know where to find the code, you know where it keeps the configuration classes and things like that. And if you're moving between, working on multiple applications and moving between them, then you're not trying to remember what you did with this one and what you did with that one. They've used this common structure. And we can also generate commands to generate those sort of the CRUD stuff. So, there's still probably going to be an element, whatever application you're doing, there's usually some element of just creating maybe an admin section that lets you do this stuff, and it's a lot of repetitive code. So one of the things you're getting with a framework that's not part of the components is these commands for generating that code. So you're generating controllers and the actions, and you're registering it with routing and forms and what have you. And because it's generated code as well, it gets you up and running quickly, but then you can go in and make the changes to things that are interesting and different about your application. So then we can start to, be a bit happier in our work, and we're going to concentrate on making progress with the application and seeing things happen. And, for me and for this guy, this will, makes me happy when I'm doing stuff, seeing progress. I'm not getting bogged down in detail of those things. You can start to kind of tick off the issues that you've been given. You can, report back to the sort of stakeholders of the project and see that these things it's starting to take shape and quickly, and you got off the ground, you got up and running fast, start to implement their ideas. You can go, you get feedback from them earlier. They're not just waiting on you to say, well, I've got these components, and yeah, they're really cool, and they do all this stuff, but I'm not quite sure how I'm going to connect them all up yet. So that's, I think, one of the really good things. And you're not, because Symfony 2 is based, like the framework is based on these components, you're still using that same flexible set of components. You're not tying yourself into a particular way of doing things. So the bits that you do need to do differently for application, you can do. It's just that you don't also have to then wire up all the bits that aren't any different. That's done for you, and then you can go in and change the other application, other configuration. So, one of the other things I think guys find it's this diversion is that when you want to start using add other functionality, so you want to make use of those other libraries that are included in the framework, and they're all standalone libraries. You can use them outside of the framework, and when you're doing that, there's quite often a lot of additional code that you have to write to set up the actual objects and things that you need to use for your application. And yeah, that's writing code, which is what we want to do, and people say, I don't want to write config, I want to write code. But a lot of this code is not the interesting code. This is just the low-level sort of, it's almost configuration in code form anyway. And writing config doesn't take as long as writing code. So you can have both, right? Get things up and running quickly with some configuration, and then you get time to write the interesting code. Not, well, I got to write loads of code, but it's pretty boring code. So, and I'm going to use Aesthetic as an example of this because it's one of the libraries that comes with the standard distribution. But you've got other things, so Monologue, SwiftMailer, Twig, template. These are all things you can use standalone, and they come with the standard distribution, but you're getting more than just those things pre-installed. So let's say we're building an application. We're going to use Aesthetic because we want to manage those front-end files, our JavaScript files, our CSS files, and our front-end developers want to keep their code separate. They want to be able to manage it, not keep it in one almighty file. But we want to combine it for the front end to reduce the HTTP requests, make the front end nice and responsive, and we also want to run it through some filters. We want to run it through the UE compressor, reduce the file size, get that down quite a bit. And you may also find that your front-end developers want to start using things like CoffeeScript and Sass, so we can't just serve them up as static files, we have to like compile them first. So Aesthetic can do all this for you, and we're not having to write code to actually do that. But let's have a look at, I guess, what we'd have to do if we were using it standalone and not using it as part of a framework, is that we need to start writing code like this. We need to start saying we've got a filter, which is the UE compressor. We're adding it to a filter manager. We're setting up an asset factory, telling it where the CSS is, telling it about the filter manager. We're saying these are the CSS files that we want to combine. We want to run it through the UE compressor filter, and then tell the asset manager about that formula, about those files that we want. And then we need to get that back out again. So we might write a controller action. We're going to route to that CSS file, do all the stuff that was on the previous slide. And then we've also got to we've got to create a response, got to set the content from, get the asset manager to do all that work for us and set that as the response, make sure we've got the correct header types, and then return the response. And here we haven't even dealt with caching at all, so we're just going to be doing this every time, so that's a bit more code that we've got to write. And this is just for one of the CSS files, so if you're also serving up print files or IE-specific CSS files that you need to serve up as separate files, you're going to have to do something similar if you take this approach. You're going to have to create a route for those as well, run through all this similar thing, and the same for our JavaScript. Now, essentially, you'll end up seeing a lot of repetition here, which obviously, as good developers, we don't want to repeat ourselves, so we could abstract away from that and find, like, well, we can just tell it, we just need to say what filter we want to use. We just need to say what CSS files. Everything else is just the same boilerplate code that just tells Aesthetic about it. And so, yeah, we could, reduce it down, abstract it, pull it out into a config file, and it's great. So we're not repeating ourselves all the time doing all that. But if you're using the full stack framework, then you can just let the bundle, the Aesthetic bundle that comes with it as well, do this for you. So this is all done already in the bundle, this abstraction. You can just set it up with config. So we can replace that boilerplate code. We don't have to write it in the first place. We can just configure Aesthetic, and that's all we need to do to set up our filters. In fact, I think pretty much you have to uncomment this from the config file that comes with the standard distribution. And the other thing is we don't need to create those controller routes, because if we're using Twig for our front-end templating, which again, it's a separate library, you can use it on its own, but what you get is this from the bundles that are in the framework is this integration between them, so that so instead of just using Twig over here and using Aesthetic over there, then Aesthetic's going to register, the Aesthetic bundle is going to register a Twig extension, which gives you these blocks, so that we can just, in our Twig template, specify that we want to add a link to a CSS file, but we want it to be made up of these three files. We want to filter it through the UE compressor. And then that's it. Aesthetic or a controller that's in the bundle will now take care of creating that route for you, making sure that that file gets set up for you. So you can start to avoid a lot of the work that might generally be involved in using these sort of things standalone as separate components. And this is quicker than writing that other code. We can just go, someone else has done it for us. We're not repeating the work that's already been done. And it means that you get to go on and do, make progress with the application and write maybe the stuff that you're really interested in doing, rather than just repeating work that other people have done and just getting these, so you want to add, this additional functionality, you can just do it quickly. We don't have to write a load of sort of code to do it. And that, that's not really the interesting code. It's like all you're really doing is configuration in the form of code. So why not just do it in the form of configuration, because it's just much quicker. And so talking about, so a lot of this extra functionality is coming from the bundles that you get, and that glue the framework, or the different parts, these disparate parts of the framework together and integrate them together. So, and I've had a look at sort of adding up the sort of number of things that you get in there. So for the current release of the standard distribution, we're getting 756 PHP files with sort of just over 10,000 lines of code. So that's 10,000 lines of code that you don't need to write as part of your application. It's there, it's done for you. That work of stitching these together has already been done. And likewise then, I think that Symfony 2 can sometimes have a bit of a reputation that, well, it's just all writing config, you're not doing anything else. And there is a lot of configuration in there, and it's a good thing, because the way these things are fitted together is configured. It's not tied to doing in a particular way. Because it's configured in this way, then when the default configuration doesn't suit your needs, you can override it, you can make changes to it, and get it to work in the way that you do want it to work. But that's not to say that you have to write an almighty amount of configuration in order to get it there in the first place. Like, there are a lot of XML files in those bundles. This is a lot of configuration that's already been written for you. You can just add the bits that the framework couldn't possibly know that's specific to your application, or override the bits that aren't quite how you want them to be, that make the changes for how you would like your application to be. And this isn't limited to a static, it's similar for a lot of the other components. So the form component has the twig functions that are registered that tie the two together so that we can quickly output forms. So a simple form widget thing that just renders a whole form, or the other ones that give you that sort of lower level control over it. And all this just helps to speed up the process. And this is not just true for the things that come in the standard distribution, but also for other sort of libraries that you might want to add, start getting functionality from them into your application. There's a lot of third-party bundles out there, and they provide the same functions. So someone's written that code to glue the application into a Symfony 2 application, so to bridge the gap between how you use that library standalone and how you would want to use it as part of Symfony 2. So, one example we've got here is that, so if we want to use Imagine for image manipulation, so Imagine's a library that sort of abstracts image manipulation away from those lower level drivers like GD and iMagick and GMagick, which, if you've ever written much with using the GD functions, it's got to be a good thing, because they really did, made it hard work to do anything, and Imagine makes that much more straightforward. But if we use that with the bundle, so there's the Loop Imagine bundle, then it reduces using Imagine just to adding a bit of configuration to tell it where our files live and which of those drivers we're using, and then we set up, in this case, filter, so in this case calling it thumbnail and making it so it creates 180 pixel wide thumbnails. And then again, it also integrates with Twig. It registers a Twig function that lets us quickly just say, when I'm adding an image, but I just want it to, so I'm going to find the path of that image, just pass it to this filter, and it will automatically thumbnail it to that. So you can get this, just start adding things like thumbnails to your site and other image manipulation really quickly without having to actually write any code. And it's just another thing ticked off the list. It's like, right, thumbnailing the images, done. There's no, I had to write code to do this, and I had to get the stuff from Imagine, set up how it should work, or any of that. It's just, by using the integration that the bundle provides you, you can just get there with a little bit of configuration and straight out of your templates. So if we can start doing things like this, then everyone will be happy with the quick progress that's made. So, like, your boss and your customers, again, will be happy. They'll see these things happening, and your co-workers will be happy. Your front-end developers can work with the way they want with JavaScript and CSS if you're using a static in this way. And, yeah, sure, like writing configuration, writing XML and YAML isn't necessarily the most exciting thing you can do, but neither is the code that's just essentially writing arrays of configuration options. But it's much quicker doing that. We can get on with more exciting things. So I find that for me, one of the other diversions is it's not just writing that configuration, but it's that when you want to use a new library that you've not used before, then you've got to learn its way of doing things. So all these PHP libraries, they're not all, they have different ideas of how code should be organized, how you should go about creating their objects and configuring and putting them to use. And so whenever you're adding a new library, there can be quite a steep learning curve, and sometimes you find that it's a big, just getting anything out of it is a struggle. You've got to sit and read through all the documentations. You try out some of the examples, they don't quite work, and you've got to go away and find all this stuff. And it can really divert you from making progress, and just what you thought would be a quick sort of, right, I'm going to start using this, and it goes. It's ends up being this sort of traumatic experience trying to work out how on earth it works at all. And so I think a lot of the time when we're adding these libraries, if we're using into a Symfony 2 application, if we can use the bundles and things that go with it, the glue that puts them in, it's not just about avoiding writing that code, but what they do is start to reduce that learning curve by putting things, by sort of making them seem familiar. They make it work with the application in the way that you're used to, rather than in this sort of different way. So, for example, for this, and so, let's say we want to add Elasticsearch to our application. So Elasticsearch is a search engine that's based on Lucene, and it has a RESTful API that lets you construct sort of these, send curl requests and what have you that with a URL, and it uses JSON documents to both index and return the search things as JSON. So for a start, it feels like, first of all, there's going to be this learning curve. We've got to find out all about those JSON documents. We've got to learn all about how the curl requests are put together. And so it's a command line thing here. We're adding an index called chef PHP, and we're mapping an image type, and we're saying we want name and keywords for that. So yeah, we can learn that, and then we've got to start, we might start to think, well, in our application, how are we going to make those curl requests and stuff? So, well, if we add Elastica, which is a client library for Elasticsearch for PHP, then that takes care of quite a lot of that underlying stuff. We don't have to worry about actually making the curl requests, actually constructing the URLs. But we still need to learn about its objects and its terminology. We still need to learn that we need to create clients and tell them, get an index from it and the type, what object it is that we use to set the type mapping, and how we set the properties on it before sending it off. So none of this is complicated stuff, but it's all new stuff if we've not used Elastica before. And again, if you want to index your data, keep it up to date, keep the index up to date, then you've got to work, we've got to find out how to do that. So if we say we were, in this case, saving an image document, then we've got to find out we need to create an Elastica document and set it up with the ID of our image so that we can keep them in sync, give it the name and the keywords, and again, run through this thing. If we need a client, an index, a type, and then we can add the document. And so, again, it's nothing too much, but it's all new things you've got to learn just to be able to get anything in or out of that index, and or in this case. And then there's other questions that come up. So, okay, this is fine for adding things to the document, but what if we want to update our documents? You made a change to the image, and we want to reflect that change in the index. So, can we just do this again and fire something off the same ID? Do we need to retrieve it first so we can update it in order to keep Elasticsearch happy, or do we just need to delete it and then add a new one? So these are all things that you've got to sort of find out about and learn how all this works. But again, you can let the bundle do that for you. There's a third-party bundle that deals with a lot of this interaction. So it's not just that it's writing the config, but it's avoiding you having to take these steps to learn what's going on. And it's not that, so we don't want to learn about these libraries. It's great and it's interesting. And with Elasticsearch, there's a lot of stuff to be learned about how to do cool searches, how there's custom analyzers and tokenizers and all these things that let you perform impressive searches. But instead of getting to learn about that, if we're having to learn about the low-level integration and all this, then that's sort of diverting us into that when we could be learning about the sort of cool stuff that you can do with it. So here's where the bundle sort of comes in and lets us make that learning curve shallower and get going that bit quicker. And you've still got the opportunity to learn about how all this stuff works later on, but you don't have to do it at the start just to get going. So in this case, we're back to the configuration, but this is something that's familiar to us. We're not going, so how does Elastic work? It's like, well, I know how to write configuration in a Symfony 2 application. So instead of where, all you need to learn is what that configuration is, not work out where to put it and how it all works. So yeah, we've got the same things. This time we're just using YAML to define our index and our mappings, and that's it. How that then gets from here to Elasticsearch itself is something that you just don't need to learn straight away. You might want to later on, but just to get going, this is enough. So, and the indexing as well is already done in the bundle. So if we add this additional lines to say, tell it that we're, in this case, using MongoDB, and what our model is, then by adding this line here right at the bottom, the listener, it does all that for us. It registers a doctrine listener, but makes sure that whenever we make any changes to the model, when we add a new image, when we update the image, when we delete it, that all those changes are automatically reflected in the index. And we can get all that. You can install this and be up and running in 10 minutes. And if you had to actually sit down and learn how to do all that, it would take considerably longer. So with all this, we're getting to work in terms that you already know. We're already familiar at this point with how a Symfony 2 application works. You're used to adding that config in there. And the other thing that, for me, is a big thing with all these different, when you're adding these libraries, is that they register services with the service container. They take whatever happens in these libraries, and they create services in the container that you can then inject into your controllers, get them from the container, and make use of in that way. So, and these are things that we're familiar with. We know how to work with services from the container. So when we want to get stuff from the search index, we just need to find out what the service is and get that from there. So when you're learning a new library, it stops it from being like, well, how does their code work? I need to work out what's going on with that. It makes it more of a case of like, well, I just need to learn what services it registers with the container. And when we know how to work with those already, we can just get things from there. So don't need to know so when I search with an index, what happens? How does that get transformed into this low-level curl request that gets sent off to Elasticsearch. All we need to know is what service do I use to do that? And that's a much quicker thing to learn. And it reduces the sort of conceptual gap between how you work in a Symfony 2 application and how you work in whatever library this is. And you just don't get that if you're putting these things together standalone, so that you don't have this common way of working necessarily if you're just making something out of this disparate selection of components and libraries, whereas using the framework gives you this sort of conceptual framework for how you can think about these things. And so the bundles, if you reduce that gap in the way that you might think of things between how your framework code works and how the library works, and it puts these things in terms of these services that you already know about. And this is, not just for Elasticsearch, it's for lots of things. I was working on an application at some point where we were going to use RabbitMQ for messaging, and it's like, well, this isn't something that's new to me. I need to go away and learn all about how it works, how you get things in and out of the queuing system, of the message queue. But because there's a great bundle for it, and a PHP library that actually interacts with it, that's glued into the framework through this bundle, that just wasn't the case. It was a case of saying, well, just need to tell it what queues I want and a bit of configuration, and then all of a sudden we've got services in the container that we can use. And I know how to work with Symfony 2 services, so you can just get that from the container, find out about the interface for it and how we work with it, and publish our message into it. Quite what happens after that happens and how it gets into the queue, we don't need to know about, and you might want to know about, and that's great, but you're removing that step of having to learn about it. You don't need, we can get going, see that it works, and then learn more about it and the cool things we can do about it, rather than having to learn about it in great depth before we can get anything out of it and use it at all. And then this is the sort of thing that, can make your application happen really quickly, and it can make everyone happy. Everyone who's involved will see progress and all this. They're not going to be going, well, what have you been doing for the last 3 days? Well, I've been learning about how Elasticsearch works. They're going to be like, well, I added search in 10 minutes, and I've spent 3 days adding autocomplete search and fuzzy search and all these things that I've had time to learn about. And they're the cool things you want to learn about, like how you actually, well, for me anyway, the low level kind of how does it get, how do you actually get stuff in and out of the thing is of less interest than how can I get interesting results out of it. And this can just, for me, using the framework in this way and not having to kind of sit down and wire up these things is just makes my job more enjoyable, and hopefully that can be true for some of you as well. So we've kind of looked at some of what for me are the diversions away from enjoying the job and getting somewhere. So the initial diversion away from getting up and running with your application and instead having to sit down, think about how all of those different components are going to work together. It's like you can just let the framework do that for you and be up and running. And how you can get diverted into having to write the code that integrates those libraries into your code by just letting someone else do it for you. And it's not just that you don't have to write in the first place. It means that code, if you're writing as part of your application, then it's also part of what needs to be maintained with your application. Whereas if you're using it from an open source bundle, then someone else, you might contribute towards that, but it's part of that open source thing. It's no longer the burden of maintaining it is no longer part of the application. And also, look to the diversions away from being able to quickly integrate new libraries that you've not used before by having to go away and learn every last thing about them before you can get anything out of them, by being able to quickly get them up and running in the application with a much shallower learning curve. So this has been what I get from the full stack framework and what hopefully others of you can get and make use of in your when you're actually making applications. Okay, so has anyone got any questions at all? Oh, so I should just say as well that I need to thank, he's a DPC and not here, but Rowan, one of my colleagues, for agreeing to pose for those photos. Okay.